This is a topic that's very close to our hearts. I'm a physician, he's an attorney, but the environment is really kind of like what we're most passionate about and what we spend kind of like the most time, most recently in the documentary Endgame 2050 and right now in the sequel that we're making. But there is a connection between the environment and our health that is very, very strong and it's very clear. And basically, it's because without planetary health, we really don't have human health. It's really a very compelling reason why we need to really pay attention to what we're doing to the world in which we live in. And so there are many, many ways in which our actions impact the planet. What we're going to be discussing today is food, but of course, just to give some examples, just to put it in context, I put that in there just to show how important it is to do the things that we can do easily. Like if diet is something that we can do easily, we should do it because we're also facing a lot of other challenges. Right now, I put that image of the tea. What's wrong with making tea, right? We all love tea, but it's not that there's anything wrong with it, but just to give us context. The energy that we spend heating up the water for it to boil so that it can make our delicious pot of tea is more energy than the energy that we consume in the entire day, right? But we don't think about it, it's like there's no calories or anything, but it's energy that eventually had to be taken from somewhere, either from a power plant or a solar panel or a wind thing making, energy. When we dry our hair, when we're sitting down on our bed like that happy lady smiling and reading on our book, we're using, for example, energy, and that is something that has an impact, came from somewhere. It's great for the city of Houston because we have a lot of oil and gas related business, a lot of oil and gas related money. The city is so prosperous with that, but for the environment, not the same thing. There's climate change, CO2 emissions that are altering our climate, the atmosphere. When we drove here today, for example, there's an impact with that. We turned on the key and we burn some fossil fuels. When we travel, when we wash our clothes, we use up, for example, like I mentioned, energy. Oh, but I only use solar energy. Well, solar energy also has an impact. That image that you see on the corner is from a mine, from a copper mine in Utah. We use copper even for our batteries, for the phone, for which I use all the time. It has lithium, which also came from a mine. My car is electric. Well, that also had an impact. So I'm just putting these examples, not to depress you or anything, but just to put in context how important it is to when we have the option of doing something for the environment that is within our hands, that doesn't require all this money and infrastructure to be put in, I think that we should be embracing it because we're also facing all these other environmental challenges which also require our attention. This is just an image from Greenpeace. It's not a real whale, it's a plastic whale. Those are plastic bags that are lining the shape of what looks like a blue whale. Is that a blue whale? Like the shape of that? All I know is they are filter feeders. They open their mouths, they take all this water in, and then they close it, and then all the water comes out of their sides, and what's inside of their water, inside of their mouths, stays in their stomach, and that's why they're called filter feeders, and they're showing up every day with their stomachs filled with plastic. According to some very conservative numbers from the United Nations, there's more than 8 million metric tons of plastic that go into the ocean every year. That's the equivalent of more than 1,000 garbage trucks filled with plastic dumped into the ocean every day. If you watched our movie, we have an animation that shows that. But it's like, the whales. Well, no, but it's not just the whales, everything comes back to bite us. Everything comes back to bite us. We're not independent from the environment. We are dependent on the environment to support our lives for many, many things, more than we realize. And for example, what do we have now? Plastics found in 90% of table salts. These are microplastics, which we don't really have a good understanding of how our bodies are going to react to. We see that in fish, it changes their behavior. It goes into their gonads, it goes into their liver. We don't know what is going to happen in humans. It's a very new field. it's not a desirable situation to be messing with the environment and one that we completely depend on for our lives, right? So again, this was all not to depress you, not to give you anxiety. So our collective food habits have a very profound, very important impact on the planet we live in as well. And interesting, this is a picture that I grabbed from the American Heart Association. It was like their healthy eating, title of the page, and they had that picture, and everyone looks very happy, and they've got some salad, they've got some grains, they've also got some, it looks like, is that like roasted chicken? Is that what it looks like to you? Like they're all eating some kind of meat as well.
Yeah. Maybe.
And so we're gonna talk a little bit about the impacts of our food choices. And the title of this talk is called Environmental Urgency of Our Food Choices. And some people may say, well, what's the big urgency? What's the big urgency now? Humans, we've been around for 200,000 years as modern humans. And then our ancestors before that, we've been around for a really long time. So what's the big deal now? We've always been eating. If we don't eat, we die. So what would be so different now that there's an urgency? And there are some things that are different now than they were in the past. One of the big things that stands out is the fact that when farming began 10,000 years ago, our world population was estimated to be about 4 million people in total, which is about the population of Houston.
Okay. People than metropolitan Houston.
Okay, so that was what we had on the planet when we started doing farming. Less people in the entire planet than what we had in Houston. And I think that's when we started farming actually was 11,000 years ago, not 10,000 years ago. So that was about 1,000 years after we started farming. And I think the estimate is when we started farming 11,000 years ago, I think the estimates that I've seen is that there were around 1 million people on the planet. So it is a different world that we're living in. It is a completely different world. And people may say, well, we've been eating this way forever. We've been eating, for example, animal foods forever. Okay, but we're living in a completely different world now. It's not like it was before. It's a different situation. It's an interesting graph. It kind of looks like a hockey stick, right? It kind of goes flat and then it goes up. And you may wonder, well, what happened right there? Because it seems very clear that there was something that happened right there that changed the course of our demographic history. And there is something very specific that happened right around that time. And we can name that easily with 2 words: fossil fuels. We started using fossil fuels. That was when the Industrial Revolution came about. The first steam engine was created, and then we could pump water. We could pump water out of the coal mines. We could pump coal out of the mines. We could use coal to make cars, to make concrete, to make iron, to make ships, to build buildings, to build roads and railroad tracks. And this all brought about the Industrial Revolution, followed by the Medical Revolution, because we weren't as worried about where we got our next meal, because now we had tractors that could do the work of what we used to have to do in maybe 5 days. Maybe the tractors would do it in 10 minutes. There was a lot of more abundance of food, and it brought, like I mentioned, the medical revolution, even things like antibiotics. In the past, a tooth infection, I would probably just die. And now, or a scraped knee or whatever, maybe I would just, die from other simple things that now we have more technology to change that. Actually, in that graph I was looking, it says global life expectancy before 1800 was less than 30 years. Global life expectancy in 2019 was 73 years. So it did change, and that dramatically changed collectively our course of our demographic history on the planet. And so we're growing right now, still currently, about 80 million people a year, which is a little, it's kind of close to Germany, actually, not the UK. UK, I think, has like 65 million people. So we're growing still quite a bit. We're growing about 1 million every 5 days, about 1 billion every 12 years. So things have changed dramatically in the last 200 years. And with it, it has had an impact on our demand for different things. So for example, our demand for meat, for animal products. Our demand for it has grown significantly, just as you can see in the last decades. Another thing that has increased our demand for meat is the bigger middle class, an increase in wealth. As people go from poverty to middle class, they tend to consume more animal foods, which is very unfortunate, because as we've talked, you guys have seen in the other lectures, the health impacts that meat has, it's not a desirable one. But that tends to be the trend, that people tend to consume more animal foods. It's still increasing, which is concerning. So the demand for dairy and chicken and beef and pig meat is still increasing. That was a slightly older projection from the FAO, from the United Nations Environmental Program. And they said that they projected an increase in dairy consumption by about 20% over 10 years, which is very dramatic. 20% more dairy in 10 years, like as you can see, that's very dramatic. And that should be unsettling, because we know the impact that dairy, that growing cows has on the planet. And now you may ask me, well, is it only animal foods that has been changed as our needs have grown so dramatically? And the answer to that is honestly, no, it's not only that. So we are having an impact on everything that we eat, okay? So for example, I chose this example. I am from Mexico. This thick accent is from Mexico. You may have been wondering, there is your answer. I wouldn't ask you, because people are like, where are you from? And when I ask them, guess, they're always like, Russia. And all these places, it's like, no, right next door, Mexico. Anyway, I am from Guadalajara, Mexico, which is in Jalisco, which is a state that produces a lot of avocados. And it's next to Michoacan, a state that produces most avocados in all of Mexico. And we have had a very significant, crazy deforestation, especially in the last decade, of all of this forest that is being turned into avocado plantations. And hold on, okay. I'm going to something, okay? Don't be like, oh my gosh, she's telling me not to eat anything, not avocado, not meat, not chocolate. Hold on, I'm getting to something. Okay, what do we have here? My favorite comfort food. I may even reward myself today with a little bit of that. I'll say I give a talk, so I deserve a little bit of chocolate. But okay, with cacao, well, cacao comes from, a lot of it from West Africa. It is causing significant deforestation in West Africa. Ivory Coast and Ghana the most. This graph from the International Wildlife Conservation, it says, the grayish stuff, it says forest loss, and the green sliver is remaining forest. And it says 1/3 of it, of the region, due to cocoa production. So even our chocolate production is causing an impact in the world, because it is a big scale. Our scale of it is very, very significant. Even coffee in Colombia, asparagus is causing a lot of water depletion in Peru, where they produce a lot of it. These things you see in the corner, what are they? Green beans. No, actually the ones on the bottom are green beans. And it looks like the label says that they are produced for Sainsbury's, which is a supermarket in London or in the UK, which I've been to. And where are they from? They're from Kenya. But you know what? In Kenya, they are having significant water shortages, just in general, with everything. And it's very sad, that little water that they have, they're using it and putting in these exports, So it is, like I said, it is having a significant impact. All of our foods. And you may tell me, well, if all of it, if the cacao is destroying Ghana, and the avocado, you're telling me it's destroying your home in Mexico, and all of this, then what is the point of doing my diet any different if it's all causing so much destruction? And the answer to that is, yes, all of our collective diet is causing significant destruction. But there is something disproportionate about animal foods, Okay, there's something in particular more inefficient about them, which is why we need to avoid them, which is why we need a vigorous collective action away from that. Okay? Yes, everything has an impact, but this is disproportionate. And the reason why they have a disproportionate impact on the planet, we have a middleman between the plants that are grown, the plants that use fertilizer, water, soil, transportation, all of that. These plants that were calories, then they go through an animal and then sacrificed and slaughtered, according to the University of Minnesota. And actually, we interviewed the authors of this study for our film, so you guys should watch it. And you know, it's funny because the University of Minnesota is such a pro-agricultural university. Like, we were surprised when we went there. There were like pigs being studied. Like, in the middle of the university, they had all these stations with different lambs and pigs and cows, right? It's like a very agricultural, because Minnesota, and the scientists from this university, they published this article that said, only 12% of the calories that are fed to animals ultimately contribute to our calories that we eat. So what that means is that there's this huge loss, waste of calories in this process, in this very inefficient process. And we're not at a time in history when we should be doing that, right? We shouldn't be wasting calories when we are at a point when we should be doing the opposite. We should be eating smartly, being efficient about how we use our planet's natural resources.
Well, I mean, think about, we hear a lot about avoiding food waste in general, and you should finish everything on your plate and just be conscientious of that. Well, anytime you're eating animal foods, at least on average, you could think of it as you've just wasted 90% of the calories, that went into making it. So it's like throwing 90% of the food away that you're consuming by consuming animal foods. I mean, not directly, but indirectly, that's the hidden cost as far as the inefficiency and the food waste that's involved.
So what that ends up happening is that it uses a lot of land. This is a snippet from the United Nations Livestock Long Shadow Report. But it says that right there, it's not like a PETA, nothing against PETA. I love PETA. I actually once had the opportunity to talk to Ingrid. She's one of the most amazing persons I know in the planet. But it's not what I'm saying. It's from the United Nations, so this source, and they're saying, the livestock sector is by far the single largest user of land. This is another source. It's saying livestock occupies 45% of the global surface area, from the International Livestock Research Institute. So that's a lot, right? That's a lot. That's a problem. And it's not a problem just for us. Obviously, we're not the only species that lives on this planet. We're one of many species. And what's happening right now with the other species? They're dying, right? And the main driver for species extinction, there's many drivers. There's climate change, there's the fractioning of the environment, there's like pesticides, there's all these drivers, right? But the main one is simply habitat loss. They lose their environment, just like if we lose our homes, they lose their environment and they die. And so, and it's a lot of species, it's not just the iconic ones. We tend to gravitate towards, oh my gosh, lions, rhinos. When we see like koalas, oh my gosh, and I love koalas. I love rhinos, I love all of the giraffes, But it's also a lot of species that we are not even familiar with, even species that we haven't even discovered, that are going extinct before we even discover them. And it's also species like insects. Insects are species that people tend to kind of rejoice when they go extinct. It's like, oh great, the insects, so annoying, we hate them. But you know what, we depend on the services that they produce. Insects help pollinate 75% of our crop species, including things like carrots, which we depend on for vitamin A, which we depend on for our eyes to produce the proteins in the retina that differentiates like night vision and all of that. So insects are the base of our ecosystem, and they are plummeting in a very significant way. Actually, in this graph, they don't even show insects, but they are plummeting even more than the other species. So what this graph is showing is what they call the background rate. You see that dotted line is the rate at which species normally go extinct. Species have a finite lifetime. It's normal for species to go extinct. But the situation that is happening now, the rate at which it's happening now, is more than 1,000 times quicker for them to go extinct than what is normal. That's really a problem, you know? So they're dropping so significantly that scientists classify our times right now that we're in the middle of as the 6th mass extinction in Earth's history. For context, there have been, obviously, if this is the 6th one, there have been 5, you know, prior to this. When was the 5th mass extinction? Which was the 5th mass extinction? Raise your hand. Oh, very good, about 65 million years ago, and that was when the dinosaurs went extinct. But the dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago, but that was like a very specific incident which drove that extinction. There was a meteorite landed close to the Yucatan Peninsula and caused all this smoke to come out, and you know, it covered the sky, and the light couldn't come through, the plants died, you know. It was a very complex thing, and it actually took a lot of years. People think, oh, the asteroid hit, and like the next day all the species. No, it was actually an extinction that took thousands of years. Thousands of years, even after a precipitous incident that brought it on. And yet here, what are we seeing? We are seeing this accelerated extinction in just decades. So, as I mentioned, biology is classified as the 6th mass extinction. You know, in our film, we have a part that we talk about how 50% of biodiversity has plummeted in 40 years. And the moment we released our film, a new report came out making our film outdated. Thank you very much. But it was like much more dramatic. And it said that 68% between 1970 and 2016. But I guess ours sounds more catchy. 50% in 40 years, that sounds like more easy. And so they are in a free fall, and yet what is the United Nations telling us? The United Nations is telling us that our food production is going to have to double by 2050. So because we continue to grow and we continue to have our food habits turning towards what the wealthy nations eat, you know, towards meat and animal products as we go from, as we grow our middle class. So that's really concerning. I mean, look at all the damage that we're causing now, and imagine like double the food production. That is a problem, and that is why it's so important that we pay attention to what we're eating, because it is a tool that we have at our disposal that could very significantly buy us time, give us time to, you know, to fix the other issues that we're facing on the planet. And so this is a paper from scientists in Oxford?
Yeah, Springman's
Springman in Oxford in the United Kingdom. And you know, it's really interesting because here is the United Nations telling us that food production must double by 2050 to meet our demands that are expected to be, you know, happening in 2050. And then here is the Oxford, UK scientist saying, okay, if we do that, if we increase by close to 100%, if we double our food production, that is beyond the planetary boundaries that defined a safe operating space for humanity. Notice there's no mention about like the other species, and I understand like this is how we work as a species, you know, it's always about, but they're saying, hey, this is beyond the operating space for humanity, you know? If it's beyond the operating space for humanity, I don't even want to know what it is for all the other species that are in a free fall right now. But I'm sure that it's a very perilous situation, really dangerous, really sad. Okay, so another paper published by scientists in Oxford found that if we collectively transition to plant-based diets, we could use 75% less area of the land that we're currently using. Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be nice? I mean, think about the fact that we are like close to beyond, beyond safe operating space for humanity. Look at the fact that like the species are in a free fall. They're going extinct. Species that they're the only other companions in the universe, if you think about it. There's no other companions in the universe that we know of. And they take millions of years to evolve. And they're going extinct because of our actions. And it's not just, you might say, well, that's aesthetically bad, because then it's not going to be as nice, the planet, without all this robust diversity of species. It's not just that, and that is also a consideration. It's also that they produce services that we depend on. Like I mentioned, like pollination. They pollinate, like the pollinators, they pollinate 75% of our crop species. They clean the water, they produce oxygen. We need this. We're not in a bubble. We need the services they provide. So keeping all of this in context, I think it is, as I know I may sound like, oh, so negative, like, oh, so much bad news. But I think this is a great news, that if we collectively transition to plant-based diets, we would have so much more land available. I think that's something to smile about, something at our disposal, something that we can do.
I think this is an area people are more familiar with, or at least have heard more about, is just the connection between meat consumption and the current climate crisis. And we really are at kind of a very precipitous moment when it comes to what we're doing to the climate. We've been warned by scientists, the IPCC of the United Nations, that there's just a very narrow window to substantially reduce our emissions to avoid catastrophic climate change and stay, I think at one point the goal was to stay under 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global average temperature above pre-industrial times, and they've increased it to 2%, I guess, for just given how much is already built in and we've committed to. And so there's no getting around the impact that climate change is going to have, but the window of opportunity to soften the landing as much as possible is really rapidly closing. Animal agriculture is a significant driver. Obviously, it's not the only driver, it's not even the biggest driver. The biggest driver is, maybe there was one report that actually threw everything in and said animal agriculture was 51%, but most estimates have it between 12 and 18%. And here from the United Nations Livestock's Long Shadow, they estimated at 18%. So it's a significant part of our activities that are driving climate change. And the reasons for it, are a combination of just, again, the inefficiency that Sophia was talking about, particularly land use change, given just, if 45% of the global surface area is being used for animal agriculture, it's not forests, it's not natural wild areas that would normally sequester CO2 out of the atmosphere and help balance out and stabilize climate. It's now being used for our purposes, for grazing land, for growing feed crops and things like that. It's also the digestive process of particularly ruminants like cows, goats, sheep. Again, it's not just these animals will be out there anyway doing their digestive things. We're breeding them by the billions into existence, repetitively to, fatten up, kill, breed more over and over. So the quantity of greenhouse gas emissions that come from that population of animals that wouldn't otherwise exist is attributable to us and our actions. And then, of course, there's just, the emissions from just everything else that goes along with the inefficiency, transporting the crops and, just the refrigeration of the meat and everything else. It's just a large enterprise. The other piece of it is, I was talking about the digestive process of cows and ruminants and the contribution that has. These aren't just CO2, which may be the most important overall greenhouse gas that we think about for climate change, but there's also methane and nitrous oxide that comes from the manure and also comes from the digestive system of these animals that we're breeding into existence, and they're many times more potent at warming the climate than is CO2. And so here you see a significant contribution that the UN reports. 37% of anthropogenic methane which is very conservatively, I've seen higher estimates, but they're saying 23 times the global warming power of CO2, and then nitrous oxide with 296 times, and 65% of nitrous oxide coming from animal agriculture. So it's a substantial part of what's driving climate change. And the good news is, and I think this is, with all the, kind of concerning and distressing information that this topic entails, the good news is, at least when it comes to what we can do as individuals, this is something that requires no technology, no new technology, doesn't require a whole lot of time, and we don't have a lot of time, but this is something that people can do with their very next meal, and the impact would be substantial.
The nitrous oxide, so it says it makes 65% of the nitrous oxide, which is 296 times the warming potential of CO2. That's mostly from water. That's amazing.
And again, just given the difference in what's required to produce the food, the average 2,000 calorie a day diet, who's eating a standard American diet, is about 2.5 times the carbon footprint of somebody who's consuming a plant-based vegan diet. A recent paper out of Stanford that, again, we have this narrow window of time, but this is just a little bit of good news in the mix, as far as at least what we could do if we do it. But a transition to vegan diets over the next 15 years would have, they measured, the same effect as a 68% reduction in CO2 through the year 2100, which would provide 52% of the net emission reductions we need to limit global warming to that 2% Celsius threshold and to try to avoid catastrophic climate change. So it's not just that we can do it, there's just no way we're going to come close to these targets if we don't do it. Within the time that we have and the technology and the limitations of how long it'll take to roll out green energy, some of the impacts that green energy has, so it's not a full reduction of just how much fossil fuels you're leaving in the ground and not using. It's something that we should all support. It's something I think that we need to move rapidly towards. But without this component, I don't see how we come close to meeting the targets that have been set for the reductions needed to avoid a catastrophic climate catastrophe. And so, to provide 52% of the net emission reductions in 15 years simply by doing what we all have available that we could do today, which is consuming a plant-based diet and moving rapidly away from our production and consumption of animal products. The other thing that you hear quite a bit about is also eating local, which is a great idea. If you're going to eat an apple that's produced in Texas versus eat an apple that was shipped in from overseas, it's better to eat the apple that was grown here in Texas. The transportation miles really is a small percentage of what constitutes the carbon footprint of a food product. It's more the type of food, not the transportation miles. Transportation miles for most foods are fewer than 10% of the total carbon footprint required for that food. So it's not insubstantial, but it's not the bulk of it. And even for something like beef, you hear about, it's local meat that I'm eating, or local beef. Beef, it's about 1.5% of its carbon footprint is associated with transportation miles, and the rest is just all of the inherent inefficiencies and everything else required to produce beef. On water security, so we've probably heard a lot in the news about Lake Mead and aquifers drying up and droughts. This is a serious and increasingly scarce resource problem that we have. Only about 2.5% of the water on the planet is fresh water, and we have just that to use for all of our purposes. And the majority of water that we use is in the food that we eat. It's mostly used for agriculture. There's a lot of water that's used for other things that are environmentally problematic, fracking, and mining and everything that we do requires water, but about 90% of our individual water footprint is associated with the food that we eat. And so this is, again, just an area where the inefficiency associated with animal agriculture and what it takes to produce animal foods weighs very heavily on our fresh water availability and security situation. And here's an infographic. So It's kind of hard to imagine you buy 1 pound of beef if you could fit 1,700 gallons of water in your shopping cart, with that, just to put into context what it is that you're actually buying and what went into it. And of course, it takes water to grow our plant-based foods as well. But if you take a look at the, whatever the measure is by weight, by per calorie, by per gram of protein, by and large, the foods that are the most water intensive on the bottom are the animal foods, and the ones that require the least amount of water to produce are the plant foods. On average, the production of foods for somebody that's eating a regular standard American diet is about 2 times that of a plant-based diet. I mean, you hear, people, railing against how thirsty almonds are as a crop. And that may be true, but we're not eating an almond-only diet. When you're eating a plant-based diet, you're eating a diversity of different, vegetables, fruits, nuts, seeds, beans, and other things. And on balance, a balanced, healthy plant-based diet compared to a typical omnivore diet, it's about half the water footprint. So it really does make a difference. And you multiply that by 8 billion people, consuming a normal diet, it makes a huge difference when that's 90% of each of our water footprint, if we can cut all of that in half. And so this is a report from a while ago from the Stockholm International Water Institute, SIWI, and they projected that we will not have enough water to produce the food needed for the projected population by mid-century unless animal-based foods are reduced to 5% or less of the global food or calorie consumption. So it just kind of puts another note in. It's not just the water we're drinking, of course. It's all of the water that's needed to grow the food that we depend on. This next slide is, I think, a study that was done by Beyond Meat for Beyond Burgers. And I know we're talking about healthy plant-based diets, but every now and then a Beyond Burger I find it to be a nice treat. They did a study just to compare, just for illustration purposes, like what's the difference between what goes into a cow meat patty versus one of their Beyond Meat, non-animal vegan patties. And their vegan burger, from the results of their study, generates 90% less greenhouse gas emissions, requires 46% less energy, has more than 99% less impact on water scarcity and 93% less impact on land than would be as compared to a 1/4 pound of US beef. So that's pretty stark, just as an example. And of course, the further down you go, the healthier foods you eat, the unprocessed fruits and vegetables and grains and things like that are even going to have a lower resource footprint than processed vegan food like a Beyond Burger. So, this is still a great comparison just to show the difference between two sort of equivalent products that are on the market to have a hamburger, but it just really illustrates the significant resource inefficiency for water and really for everything else associated with using animals for food.
And I did want to emphasize what he just said about the processed foods. I love processed vegan foods. I love them. It's not a healthy option. It's not healthy. But really the ideal diet for our bodies is an unprocessed plant-based diet. And also, that kind of triangle that we show of the inefficiency with the animal foods, that you take all this food and then you get the animal food. The same situation happens with processed foods, even with processed vegan foods, even with processed oils, So, yeah, of course, Beyond, they're doing their study and showing, compared to beef, it's much better for the environment. But truly, much better for the environment is really just eating, plants, grains, lentils, things like that. And, just one thing that comes to mind, they have, are they like coconut oil? Is that what they Beyond and Impossibles have?
I think they do.
Okay, just to an example, everybody goes crazy with palm oil, right? Because you see it in the news, it's getting awareness. Well, coconut oil is grown in the same areas as palm oil, and coconut oil is a lot more inefficient than palm oil. So per land area, you get more oil from palm than from coconut. But there's a big drive now with everybody getting awareness of palm oil, and there's more, okay, coconut oil seems to be like an acceptable alternative. Well, it is still causing significant deforestation. It's more inefficient than palm oil, and it is also grown in these same tropical areas, these beautiful forests that like are being leveled by the thousands of square miles every year just to grow more and more and more oil, you know? So from an environmental perspective, since the topic of this talk, after all, is the impact of our food choices, it really does make sense to go with an unprocessed diet as much as we can. So not just vegan, like unprocessed vegan diet. If we care about the animals, the land, all of that, really that makes a point. I mean, that makes a difference. I just want to share with you this quote from the former chairman of the American College of Cardiology, Dr. Kim Allen Williams. And he said there are two kinds of cardiologists, the vegans and those who haven't read the data. And I love that quote, you know, because it does, you know, there's been so much research into how much, as Dr. Rees here, who's a vascular surgeon, right? And so you can attest to how big of a difference our diet makes. And this is a quote from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. So they published their like position paper, because you know, you go online, you go on YouTube, you can find a wide variety of everyone telling you their secret diet. You know, you need bone broth for your bones, and I guess we need eyes for our eyes, and I guess we need to eat livers for our liver, you know, like these nonsense. And some of them, they come across with a lot of credibility, and they got a lot of followers, whatever. And so the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which is I think the largest organization of nutrition professionals in the world, they looked at the evidence, they put out their position paper, like this is our position. We looked at the evidence, we have degrees, we looked at the research, and we showed that a plant-based diet, you know, favored a reduction in chronic diseases like diabetes and cancer. And, okay, so there's the actual quote. It is our position that appropriately planned diets are nutritionally adequate and provide healthful benefits for the prevention and treatment of certain diseases, and these diets are appropriate for all stages of life, including pregnancy, lactation, infancy, childhood, adolescence, older adulthood, and for athletes. Because like, oh, but you're pregnant, you want to make sure that you eat the liver and the bone broth, and no, like, well, that's their position, okay? You know, that's the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. So it is good to see, you know, what their positions are, their position paper. And yeah, lastly, I just wanted to remind you of that. So this is something that we have at our disposal, changing our diets, and we also have a lot of challenges that are very pressing and that we also have to deal with. So that is why I think this should be a no-brainer. Like, look at this, like even our plastic use is now resulting in the meal that we just had probably had a little bit of plastic. The meals that I have, you know, with salt, I'm probably eating plastic. The yoga pants, actually not too unsimilar to the pants that I'm wearing right now. You know, I recently read that when we have these synthetic-based, plastic-based clothing, when we wash them, about 2,000 plastic fibers go into the water. I know, and it's just like, oh, I know, like what are we gonna, so that's another thing that we need to work on. Like, look at all these things. But I needed to look presentable for all you fine people. So that's why I wore these today, but I'm not gonna wash it until it stinks. But you know, the phone, like I mentioned, look, the batteries in our phones, they've got lithium. Where are they getting the lithium? Most of the lithium in the world is being mined in South America, these massive mines that if you look at like the Lord of the Rings, like these massive, that's what they look like. They're mining lithium, copper, cobalt, all these things that are used for batteries, even in the things that we think, okay, this doesn't cause an impact, this is my electric car. No, it also, you know, so we've got so many challenges on our hands. Diet should be a no-brainer. Let's just change it on to the next challenge. I recently learned that everybody must know that except me. I was probably the only moron in the world that didn't know that you use coal to make concrete and cement. So, even our roads, they use fossil fuels to be made. Our iron, all of that. So we are in a big, dangerous situation, and we need to be proactive and diligent and thoughtful about our actions moving forward. And food is a no-brainer. It's just a higher incentive to really embrace that, and so that we can move on to the next challenge. And if you want to watch our film is called Endgame 2050. It's available on Tubi TV and a few other, but it is available 100% for free without advertisements on YouTube. So you can watch it there. Yeah. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
So thank you very much for that important information. Bob, I have a question for you. So if by 2050 we need to rely less than 5% animal food production in order to meet our goal of not hitting 2 degrees, that's not going to happen, right? So what's really going to happen? Are we going to start running out of water? And then is animal production then going to go down because of that? What do you foresee happening?
I don't know, I think is the honest answer. But I think it's, if their estimates are correct, and I have no reason to believe they're not, they may be conservative, in fact, it's going to be an ugly situation. It's going to be us trying to play catch up instead of being proactive to the extent we're not at that point. There are, to the extent we're not going to have a cultural shift that's sufficient enough to get us, to that level. I guess there's, cross our fingers, maybe some technology that gives us a little bit more runway, whether it's this lab-grown meat or things that can feed people's, desire to continue eating these things without the animal input that would be a lot more water efficient. But I don't know how optimistic I am about that either. But
I mean, their statement was, if we don't do this, then there's not gonna be enough water to produce the needed food. Mm-hmm. So the answer to that is it's in their statement already. Then there's not gonna be enough food to feed the world at the time.
Okay, I don't really like to stay up here, but so I've just had this moment of realizing that my son will be 60 years old in 2050. And I'm more of an optimist, but I also understand this is a very pessimistic subject. And so my question for you is, give us something that we can do as individuals, because it all feels so much out here. There's climate issues, there's water issues, and we all think of it out there. And it's nice that we all eat our little plant-based. But what can I do to help my neighbors when I drive down the street and I see consumption? And I consume a lot of things too. I'm not trying to judge anybody. But how do I help motivate and inspire other people to take baby steps, all of us, to keep moving forward? Because I don't want to end up, like you were saying, like hopeless, and my son, who will be 60, will have no world.
That's a very important question. I believe, my background is psychiatry. I'm a physician and I'm a psychiatrist. And I believe that a lot of the way people behave is driven by survival drives. It is my belief that if people understood the severity of what we're facing, it would be a lot easier to change habits, to change our consumption, to consume less, to change our food habits. So I think just helping raise awareness is a big deal. Obviously, doing everything we can to consume less ourselves and to eat plant-based and to travel less and to try to not use plastic, although that is very, very challenging, because even things that you don't think come in plastic in the groceries, before they unpack them, they had plastic. You know what I mean? So it is a very systemic situation, but I'm a big believer in raising awareness. And I think if people realize how tied it was to their survival, we would see a much bigger and robust shift of attitudes.
The individual changes, it may sound stupid, but like little things where we had a coffee maker in our building and everyone used a little styrofoam cup, and I started bringing a mug, and then I noticed the people that were there at the same time, like the next week, would bring a mug to reuse. And that sounds silly. I think we also have to be vocal, but don't underestimate also kind of setting an example by consuming less and being visible about it too. So
I see a lot of articles about how planting, eating plants is very good for you. But one thing I don't see is discussions of how much energy it takes to make the fertilizer to make the plant. So if you expand that boundary, you're burning a lot of fossil fuels to make the hydrogen and the nitrogen to make the ammonia. And so I don't know if these studies incorporate that. Do you know?
I believe they do look at that. I'm not off the top of my head, in general, looking at it from 30,000 feet, is like Sophia was mentioning with that one Oxford study, if we ditch meat and dairy globally, we could reduce global farmlands by 75%. So even still, if we're using fertilizer for all that land, we're using all that fertilizer on 75% less land. And we certainly still need to deal with the problems associated with fertilizer, pesticides in particular, and do better with what hopefully fraction amount of land that we'll need in the future in a plant-based world. But just that reduction, I think, would be just a really material help in that area as well.
Albert Einstein said something, and he said, you can't solve a problem with the same mentality that created it. I think that's something to really think about, and I was reminded of it by the question about fertilizer. Fertilizer became a product of the Industrial Revolution. It's not necessary. It's necessary because we've depleted our soils. We've got to go back to sustainable agriculture. We have to go back to regenerative agriculture. So we're going to have to change the way we think and change the way we behave, and we have to realize that what we perceive of as wealth, particularly in the West and in the US, is at the expense of nature. It's at the expense of the animals. It's at the expense of probably, I would say, certainly the majority of the world who doesn't enjoy these standards, who consume probably only a fraction of what we consume. We've got to change. So thank you. Thank you so much.